Hello, everyone. I'm Sylvia Paul. I'm the first vice president of the club. I came up with the idea of having Barry Endick, who's a member of the club, a retired lawyer, and self-taught autodidact historian, do a talk on Keeler, one of our forefathers of this club. Lively, vibrant character, as you can see there. And we've got a table up here with all these artifacts from Keeler's house, which was the first house commissioned for the construction by Bernard Maybach, who built this place originally. So I'm going to introduce Barry, who's done research at the Bancroft Library in UC Berkeley, and he also spent 2 days, had to get permission to do research in the archives at the Huntington Library in Huntington, California, and got all these materials from the archive that have never been seen before. So you're going to hear something that hasn't been heard about for the past century.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. Good evening, and welcome to the Hillside Club's evening in appreciation of Charles Keeler. Berkeley poet and civic leader Charles Augustus Keeler was an early member and an advocate for this club. He served as the Hillside Club's president 120 years ago. Tonight's fireside talk is dedicated to the legacy of this legendary and truly unique man. We'll be sharing some views on Charles Keeler's contributions in the fields of science, poetry, architecture, and religion. We'll talk about his influence on Berkeley's artistic and literary culture, which he vigorously promoted throughout his life. And the spirit of that lives on today. Over the past few months, I've conducted some deep research on Charles Keeler, reviewing the sizable collections of original Keeler material maintained by the UC's Bancroft Library and the Huntington Museum and Library in San Marino, California, as well as rare images and ephemera held by the Berkeley Architectural Heritage Association. In the photo here, you can see Tim Hansen making digital reproductions of the glass plates and lantern slides which Baja has had in a peach crate for decades. An astonishing amount of original Keeler correspondence, manuscripts, and memorabilia still exists. Diane Ayres, a longtime club member and a celebrated embroidery and textile artist, is also here to provide enlightening visual accompaniment, presenting significant original images, many of which have never been publicly shared before. We'd like to thank the many helpful people at the institutions I mentioned, including Anthony Bruce of Baja, who have helped us share Keeler's story tonight. And we're also grateful to Diane, Tim Hansen, and Carol McPherson for bringing here to the club for display some of Keeler's personal furniture that was photographed inside of Keeler's house well over a century ago and used as an illustration in his seminal book, The Simple Home. We've also brought some Keeler books here too. We'd also like to thank Andre Chavez, proprietor of the Clinker Press, visiting from Oregon. He graciously printed this beautiful keepsake collection of Charles Keeler poems to commemorate this evening's special proceedings and as a gift to tonight's attendees. This evening will offer a glimpse of Charles Keeler's kaleidoscopic life and career. Charles Augustus Keeler was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1871. His mother, Harriet, was widowed at a young age. She suffered from poor health and was bedridden through much of Keeler's youth. Keeler's own natural father died before Keeler turned 3. Harriet ended up marrying the doctor ministering to her, John Knowlton Bartlett. Bartlett was an educated and cultured man, and at one time he'd been the toast of Milwaukee society. The man that young Charlie had always addressed as doctor had suddenly become Papa. Keeler didn't have a happy boyhood. While quite young, Keeler and his older sister Sarah, nicknamed Sadie, were sent to the Bronx, New York. They lived there with their aunt and attended a small private school. A miserably lonely Charlie returned to Milwaukee a few years later to struggle at a boarding school tantalizingly closer to home. "Dear mother," young Keeler wrote, "I am very lonesome at school. I hope you will let me come home soon. I am studying hard and trying to learn fast." As a teenager, Keeler experienced his greatest solace and refuge during summers he spent fishing and camping with his friends at Cedar Lake, Wisconsin. These annual outings awakened an early interest in botany and ornithology in Charlie. They offered him a generous opportunity to study local plant and bird life. Keeler began to collect and stuff birds, adding them to his home museum of nests and eggs. After he got a few books on ornithology, birds became teenage Keeler's obsession. Significantly, birds were the first subject that Keeler mastered, and, as he increasingly did as he matured, lectured others about. Charlie had found his tongue. In 1887, the Keeler family moved out west to the land of sunshine for Charlie's parents' health. Papa bought an attractive and fairly new stick-style Victorian home on Dwight Way in Berkeley. When the Keelers first arrived in California, Berkeley wasn't much more than a bucolic village outpost. The young city was thick with farms, home gardens, and the nucleus of a quickly growing university that had relocated from Oakland 15 years earlier. Even in those early days, the university sphere supported a core of sophisticated newcomers who had eager eyes and ears for culture and aesthetics, and an increasing number of similarly leaning men and women started to relocate to the neighborhoods around Young Cal. Keeler spent his first summer in California camping in the woods, as he usually did, but this time, for the first time, an awestruck Keeler pitched his tent in the monumental redwoods forests of Cazadero. Clearly, Charlie wasn't in Wisconsin anymore. Keeler was deeply impressed by the scale and drama of his California surroundings. He was captivated by the variety of new West Coast birds and plants that he could now examine for the very first time. In 1889, before he even graduated Berkeley High, Keeler landed a plum job for the United States Department of Agriculture. The federal government hired Keeler to survey bird migration patterns in Nevada. Months later, Keeler returned to Berkeley, completed his high school coursework, and enrolled in the nearby university. He joined Beta Theta Pi and formed and led a college evolution club. Unfortunately, Keeler's parents' illnesses and their eventual death forced Keeler to end his former schooling prematurely. Keeler wasn't able to graduate with the class of 1893. Still, a 20-year-old Charles Keeler was able to land a prestigious job working for the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco. In 1891, the Academy hired Keeler to run its Natural History Museum and oversee the publication of its monthly magazine. In 1893, Keeler wrote, and with the Academy's backing, published his first book. His lengthy treatise discussed the evolution of color in North American land birds. Keeler's detailed analysis featured an appendix with pages full of multicolored lithographs portraying different feather patterns to support Keeler's neo-Lamarckian thesis. Keeler's thesis didn't age well. Keeler followed this technical treatment with another guide to the birds of the West. This one was a popular one aimed at amateur bird watchers. Paul Elder published Keeler's Bird Notes Afield in 1899, and it was one of the first surveys of its kind. Keeler's rising profile in the bird world eventually led to him being invited to participate as a member of the 1899 Harriman, Alaska expedition to serve as both bird expert and the company's poet. During that adventure, railroad baron Edward Harriman and his family, about 36 leading American scientists in multiple fields, and a phalanx of artists, writers, and photographers took a luxury rail and steamship voyage to document the geology and biology of Alaska's coast. The Harriman party numbered 126 in all. The expedition included a virtual who's who of important naturalists and environmentalists of the time, including Keeler's Martinez neighbor, Sierra Club founder John Muir, and East Coast poet and naturalist John Burroughs. By happenstance, Keeler and a genial and talkative Muir ended up sharing a cabin while at sea. Keeler was all ears. But even as he pursued a scientific career, young Keeler increasingly yearned to follow a different path. He was plagued by growing doubts about some of his earlier scientific work, and he'd begun to sense a nobler calling. More and more often, he found himself turning to poetry, drama, and art. Keeler purchased a painting by and then befriended renowned San Francisco landscape artist William Keith. In the early 1890s, Keeler spent many evenings with Keith in his San Francisco studio and as a guest in his Berkeley home. Keeler became an unofficial adopted son to the artist. In return, Keeler bought Keith's paintings when he could afford them and sincerely promoted Keith's work at every opportunity. Eventually, Keeler decided to leave science behind for good. He became determined to try and make a living as a full-time poet and author. In making this transition, Keeler was inspired and assisted by a woman whose affections he aggressively courted, a woman who eventually became his wife. Her name was Louise Mapes Bunnell. Louise Bunnell had been a fellow student at the college who had attended some of Keeler's Evolution Club meetings. She was partial to bugs and poetry. She belonged to sister fraternity Kappa Alpha Theta and was a budding artist. Charles and Louise were well matched in their intensity and their sensitivity. They also both suffered from passing spells of exhaustion and malaise. Their romance experienced some bumps along the way. At one point, as Keeler tried to deepen his relationship with Louise, using his customary forcefulness, Louise started to question whether a marriage between two people so prone to weakness and poor health was a good idea. She decided to take a break and spend a few months in New York City studying art. Over 3,000 miles away from Charlie, Louise hoped to recover her health and gain some more experience. Keeler didn't like this development one bit. He became anxious and jealous and obsessed over the kind of men that Louise would no doubt meet in East Coast society. So, allegedly for his health, Keeler impulsively boarded a boat called the Charmer and began a 4-month sea journey around Cape Horn to intercept her. On his arrival in New York, Keeler discovered, to his unspeakable disappointment, that Louise had already departed the city just a few weeks earlier and was already on a train heading back to California. It worked out all right in the end. Charlie was able to visit relatives and the Chicago World's Fair on his own train ride back. Charles and Louise Keeler were married in 1893. Their artistic souls were very much attuned to each other's, and Louise's penned images reliably supported Charles's published words. Keeler believed that he and Louise formed a refined and talented artistic team. Louise eventually bore 3 children to Charles, daughter Meridine, their son Leonard, who years later helped invent and develop the polygraph machine, commonly known as the lie detector, and their youngest daughter, Eloise. One of the greatest impacts Charles Keeler had on the city of Berkeley stemmed from his identification, codification, and vigorous promotion of a cutting-edge style of local architecture. For many years, Keeler worked passionately to ensure that his concept of what he called the simple home would become the template for construction in the yet unsettled North Side and Berkeley Hills at the turn of the century. To carry out this mission, Keeler assumed the role of an instructive style maker, who some have characterized as an opinionated policeman of the arts. Now, Charles Keeler had never taken a single class in architecture. He'd never formally studied it at all. One could certainly challenge Keeler's qualifications to offer grand pronouncements on architecture's purpose or its mechanics. In truth, Keeler's energetic advocacy for an honest, practical, and unadorned approach to home building originated in a less vocal but better trained and more visionary artist in the field of architecture, a recent West Coast transplant named Bernard Maybeck. Keeler and Ben Maybeck's alliance for the purpose of promoting organic and artistic residential design in the Berkeley Hills and their friendship began in a chance and famous meeting. In the early 1890s, as an ambitious young scientist with poetic dreams, Keeler cut a flamboyant figure. He sported a mustachio and a cape and wielded a gold-tipped walking stick borrowed from his stepfather as he made his daily commute aboard the San Francisco-bound ferry to and from his new job at the California Academy of Sciences. Returning home on the boat one evening, Keeler approached and struck up a conversation with another oddly dressed passenger. This man was also heading home from his job sketching out interior treatments and furnishings for a high-end San Francisco design firm. Over time, Keeler learned that his new acquaintance was named Bernard Maybeck, that he was born in New York, and that he was the son of a German woodcarver. Maybeck had been educated and trained in architecture several years earlier in Paris at the prestigious École des Beaux-Arts. After he'd completed his studies abroad, young Ben Maybeck returned to the US. He worked briefly for an architectural firm on the East Coast, then hung up his own shingle in Kansas City without success. Maybeck and his family had recently made their final move to California's Bay Area. As their casual friendship grew, Maybeck shared with Keeler some of his unusual ideas about architecture and told Keeler that he wanted to design a home for him in Berkeley. Maybeck promised that the house he was envisioning would be a special one, since he planned to design it with Keeler's unique personality in mind. Keeler initially hesitated, but a few years later, as the head of a young and now growing family, Keeler visited Maybeck at his Berkeley home studio and took him up on his offer. He asked Maybeck to design his family a home to be situated on a sloped lot Keeler owned in a hillside tract once known as Daly's Scenic Park. Residential development in the area had just recently begun. In 1895, Bernard Maybeck came through for the Keeler family. He designed for them a cozy but decidedly different dwelling. Its interior walls were paneled in redwood. Its exterior was clad with natural redwood shingles. The house was built in 3 sections that rose upward stepwise to follow the natural rise of the hill it sat on. Keeler House featured high-peaked roof gables, rather remarkable given Berkeley's mild climate, and sections of its roof flared outward at its edges, giving the home a slightly Japanese appearance. Inside, the roof's high peaks were left open to the rooms below them to feature the complex joining that made the home's halls feel like a miniaturized Gothic cathedral built out of wood. The home's upper level featured a large sleeping porch, a kind of room that was starting to come into vogue. At that time, many people thought that generous exposure to night air promoted good health. Keeler House was Maybeck's first residential commission. The building still stands, although Maybeck modified it for a subsequent owner. He reclad it in stucco and separated it into smaller apartments in 1927 after Keeler sold it. The house isn't very visible from the street because it's largely blocked by apartment buildings. It's located near the top of Ridge Road on Highland Place. The completion of Keeler House proved to be a watershed. Although a few other Berkeley residences were previously built using ideas and techniques similar to Maybeck's creation, Keeler House was a choice, archetypical example of a home built in a style that was eventually dubbed the First Bay Region tradition, or First Bay tradition in architecture. First Bay tradition homes include those somewhat rustic, unpainted, shingle-style homes that pepper Berkeley fairly densely. Lovers of the arts and crafts movement covet these kinds of homes, not just for their stylistic features, but also for the ideas and ideals those aspects represent. Charles Keeler was thrilled with his unique, artistic new home, but it also presented him with an immediate challenge. Keeler worried that insensitive neighbors might end up building homes close to his in styles that he and Maybeck hated. His gem of a house could end up overwhelmed by what Keeler called stupid white painted boxes, decked out in the then popular but tasteless and ugly Queen Anne style. Indeed, the new school of modern architects, including Maybeck, argued that Victorian homes weren't really suited to the lifestyles of the people who lived in them. These new designers cringed at facades draped in tacked-on, mass-produced gingerbread. They argued that that sort of machine-made ornament degraded the dignity of individual craftsmen. Frivolous Victorian decoration lacked beauty and was sham or humbug, to use Maybeck's term, because all that Moorish fretwork, all those balls and turn spindles didn't relate to any function. Indeed, viewed through these architects' unusual lens, houses like these weren't just unattractive, they were downright immoral. Maybeck responded to Keeler's concerns over his future neighbor's plans by telling him that the problem would be solved by Keeler going out and finding sympathetic neighbors. Then, Keeler would be able to make sure that adjacent lots would end up occupied by families willing and able to commission homes that were stylistically consistent with his own. Keeler followed Maybeck's advice. In the space of a few years, Keeler had recruited a few intellectual acquaintances and friends to buy flanking lots and then build homes on them that met Keeler's and Maybeck's design specifications. In fact, Maybeck designed them too. By 1899, a row of 4 wood-clad houses snaked around the bend at the crest of Ridge Road. These were rusticated but sophisticated homes. Each of them was remarkably unique, but they were unified in their conceptual approach. The group of structures formed a loose kind of commune that created a local sensation. Looky-loos regularly hiked up the hill to get a closer gander at the freak houses, but the style slowly began to spread. As the new century dawned, Keeler had experienced a few years of domesticity with Louise and daughter Meridine in their distinctive, warm, and natural home. And as a result, Keeler had truly been bitten. He had heard the arts and crafts trumpet's clarion call and felt compelled to spread the good news of the many benefits of sensitive, honest, and functional architecture to all, but especially to the all who were considering moving into the growing neighborhoods around the Berkeley campus. To help spread the word, Keeler joined forces with a group of formidable women, including many who were the wives of prominent Berkeley citizens, including Ben Maybeck's wife, Annie, who were already focused on the project of creating an ideal neighborhood upon a virtual blank slate. These women, just like Keeler, were committed to the vision of a suburban intellectual village dotted with organic, artistic custom homes, sensitively situated within picturesque natural scenery and enhanced by lush, flowery home gardens. What's not to like? This group of women met fairly regularly in a few Berkeley homes and churches to exchange information and develop strategies to promote their community plan to newcomers exploring and building in the nearby hills. These women leaders oversaw the construction of a progressive grammar school for local school children, strikingly executed in the heavily timbered First Bay tradition style. In 1902, this women's group reorganized. It formally extended its membership to men. This enlarged alliance, which now included Keeler, Bernard Maybeck, and other local men with interests in architecture and aesthetics, and who, not coincidentally, could also vote, began to achieve a wider notoriety as Berkeley's Hillside Club. Keeler served as the Hillside Club's first secretary after this reorganization, and then as its second president. Charles Keeler's presidency of this club from 1903 to 1905 is commemorated on the plaque honoring this club's leaders on the clubhouse's wall to your left as you enter the building. Most of tonight's attendees probably know that Bernard Maybeck designed the original clubhouse for this organization on this site in 1906. It, too, was executed in the First Bay tradition style. Our current 1924 building, built after the 1923 Berkeley fire, was designed by Bernard Maybeck's brother-in-law and partner, John White. This second clubhouse revisits many aspects and features of Maybeck's original design. It is also an excellent example of a First Bay tradition building. Keeler maximized his impact by working with and through the Hillside Club. He wrote and issued brochures for the club that gave new arrivals helpful construction guidelines. He directed them to approved architects' offices or, failing that, to the curated sets of blueprints and drawings that the club maintained and which it offered enthusiastically to help make sure that newcomers towed the line. Using these strategies, Keeler and the Hillside Club successfully shaped development in the blocks surrounding us tonight, especially in the years before fire reshuffled the deck. And Keeler spread the gospel of artistic living further. Starting in 1903, during his tenure as club president, Keeler penned a series of articles discussing Northern California home and garden design for a Bay Area magazine called Impressions Quarterly. In those articles, he directed readers' attention to a new style of architecture being perfected in Berkeley and laid out its contours. In 1904, Keeler convinced San Francisco publisher Paul Elder and Company to reprint his articles in book format. All assembled, they made up a slim volume. The book was modestly designed and bound, and it eventually became Keeler's best-known book. It was titled The Simple Home. The design principles discussed in The Simple Home were based on the premise that art and culture require the kind of physical and emotional haven offered by physical structures in order to flourish. This quality was especially true as manifested in the comfort provided by one's own home. According to Keeler, the fundamental necessity of a built environment to art elevated architecture above the other creative disciplines. He argued that architecture was therefore the functional parent of all the other arts. The Simple Home advanced a key idea that mirrored a wider arts and crafts sentiment regarding the emotional impact of artistic objects and spaces. The book argues that household environments profoundly affect and alter the people who live inside of them. Keeler stated, "The mere architecture and furnishings of the house do not make the man any more than do his clothes, but they certainly have an effect in modifying him." Well, needless to say, if your home subconsciously acts on you, getting it right suddenly becomes crucial. What might otherwise be a casual home decoration decision now involves potentially corrupting or ennobling influences. Serious stuff indeed. The first substantive portion of The Simple Home addresses the layout and composition of the home's garden. Keeler suggests that in California, the house mainly serves as a structure that provides shelter to the family when the weather turns bad. During pleasant days, Californians tend to live outdoors. Keeler opined that large, flowery home gardens were ideal for areas populated on the scale of a village, like Berkeley and its surrounding areas. Less densely developed towns featured parcels that were sizable enough to support impressive, personalized botanical vignettes. Borrowing a maneuver from Maybeck's design toolkit, Keeler suggested that unconventional siting, such as placing a house near the front edge or near the rear of a lot rather than right in its middle, could maximize the area available for planting and nurturing a charming garden of vines and flowers. The irregularity of sensitively platted lots, like those staked out on the Berkeley's hilly terrain, also presented limitless creative possibilities to those with an artistic eye. As for the design of the house itself, Keeler soundly rejected popular off-the-shelf structures. He argued that copycat Victorian boxes seemed to house people just as shallow and artificial as their homes. Instead, Keeler demanded examples of architecture that, at best, rose to the level of true art, or which, at a minimum, reflected an unpretentious and utilitarian humility. The simple home, regardless of its expense, was sensitively designed to be responsive to climate and terrain. Its construction made ample use of common, locally available materials. In Northern California, this usually meant lots of redwood. This new style required tradesmen to use their construction materials in an honest way. Wooden structures, for the most part, needed to reflect that material's straightness and angularity. Rounded turrets, towers, and window bays, such as those found on the dreaded Queen Anne's, were incongruously based on stone and other masonry forms, despite their wooden framing. When builders abused the materials that made up their homes, masquerading them as others, the structures that resulted were dishonest, sham. Keeler discouraged painting or treating wooden surfaces. He wrote, "There is a refinement and character about natural wood which is entirely lost when this surface is altered by varnish and polish." Keeler argued that the best way to introduce color to the homescape was through bright gardening touches. These were natural, attractive, and true. Keeler gave his thumbs up to open-air porches, massed windows, and the sensitive use of wide roof eaves. He praised open ceilings that revealed the interplay of the structural elements that supported the roof. Exposed natural wood joists, beams, girders, and rafters made a virile, functional, and therefore attractive statement. He discouraged ornament that didn't extend organically from an element's function. He urged his readers to pay special attention to the area around the fireplace, the simple home's warm, symbolic heart. Keeler recommended that the home's curtains, portieres, and furniture all visibly reflect the individual craftsman's touch. Mass-produced bric-a-brac wasn't welcome in a simple home. The display of a few handmade decorative items spoke well of the occupants, and these presented best against a background of board and batten wood paneling or wall coverings made of grass cloth or burlap, painted in muted earth tones. When it came to wall art, Keeler considered mass-produced lithographs and tinted photographs of famous paintings far inferior to authentic original work created by local artists. One would be well advised to buy an oil landscape by William Keith and hang it prominently. Choice metalwork, exotic paper and brass lanterns, native woven baskets, potted plants, and masses of books completed the scene. If it's not obvious in populating this ideal, Keeler was essentially cataloging his own house. The weight of Keeler's simple home isn't derived from any specific innovation described in its pages. Instead, its impact stemmed from the book's organization, codification, and well-argued defense of arts and crafts ideas that were floating around nationwide at that time, intertwined with a philosophical rubric. We can observe the results of Keeler's book around us here in Berkeley every day, if we have the eyes to see. But there was much more to Keeler than just birds and simple homes. Keeler also wrote a number of travelogues. In 1898, when he and Louise were in a financial bind, Legendary author and magazine editor Charles Fletcher Lummis recommended Keeler for a job writing a travel guide for the Santa Fe Pacific Railroad, promoting Southern California cities along its Santa Fe route. As a result, Charles and Louise took a trip through the Southland together. Louise illustrated the Southern California guidebook Keeler subsequently wrote with dozens of ink drawings portraying the picturesque scenery and tourist destinations she and her husband visited along the way. In 1902, Keeler wrote another promotional piece, a wonderful travelogue called San Francisco and Thereabout. In that book, after providing a capsule history of California's settlement, Keeler accompanies his readers on a boat trip across the bay, disembarking with them at the ferry building so that Keeler can show off some of pre-earthquake San Francisco's noteworthy sights and exotic quarters. Consistent with his tendency to tout his own personal preferences when given a platform, Keeler bubbles with enthusiasm over the architecture of Reverend Joseph Worcester's still new, arts and crafts steeped Swedenborgian church in Pacific Heights, and attempts to recruit his more artistically inclined readers to move to Berkeley themselves, the land of simple homes, natural beauty, and a growing and soon-to-be remodeled campus. And Keeler plugs William Keith. 4 years later, Keeler wrote a book that serves as a bookend to this one, a 1906 page-turner called San Francisco Through Earthquake and Fire. In it, Keeler offers a vivid, first-person narration of that unfolding disaster. He was able to provide this report because, after rescuing his own children in the nick of time from the collapse of a chimney at Keeler House, Keeler boarded the first ferry he could into stunned San Francisco, which was already flecked with small fires. Keeler threw himself into rescue efforts. He volunteered as a part of an informal fire brigade to fight the fire, and then raced all over the city in an automobile to deliver messages as a part of a citizens' relief committee. Keeler's book allows us to accompany him step by step, day by day. It's a gripping record. The 1906 earthquake and fire took a heavy toll on Keeler. Its flames destroyed his remaining stock of published books. As a double blow, Louise suffered debilitating strain in the months afterwards, overworking as she assisted displaced San Franciscans during recovery efforts. Louise's health declined and she entered a sanitarium and passed away in 1907. Keeler was devastated by the loss of Louise. In some ways, he never fully recovered from her early death. Many of the poems contained in Keeler's 1919 Sequoia Sonnets, which I think is his best collection of poetry, contend with Louise's absence, as well as visions of their reconnection. Another book of Keeler's poetry worth mentioning is his collection of ditties aimed at children, titled Elfin Songs of Sunland. That volume, once again, features illustrations by Louise. Many of her drawings were based on photographs of the Keeler children, taken by famed pictorialist photographer Adelaide Hanscom. The book's simply rhymed poems feature many tributes to the winged and botanical life surrounding Berkeley. This charming collection is Keeler's most accessible work, and it has a hyper-local feel. Elfin Songs of Sunland was very successful, and it was published in 4 separate editions over a period of 16 years. In happier days, Keeler, Louise, and daughter Meridine traveled through the South Seas, exploring the exotic lands of Tahiti, New Zealand, Australia, Samoa, and Hawaii, while researching a travelogue for a steamship company. Their account was published in 1900 as Tahiti the Golden. This trip navigating the Pacific also provided raw material that Keeler exploited in his 1902 collection of lyrics called A Wanderer's Songs of the Sea. In later years, Keeler's experiences on this South Sea trip also inspired realistic settings for a series of episodes of a radio drama Keeler wrote called Skipper Brown's Yarns. These 10 little playlets, first broadcast in San Francisco in 1929, made use of radio techniques that were novel for the time, such as playing records of authentic native music in the studio while the actors read their scenes to create a more immersive atmosphere. The Bay Area's land-loving listeners were captivated by the foreign settings the radio show realistically evoked, and they wrote dozens of angry letters to KGO when it ended. After Louise's death, Keeler also traveled extensively on his own. In 1911, he deposited his children in Berkeley in the care of his mother-in-law, Catherine Bunnell. After a farewell poetry recital at the Hillside Club, Keeler embarked on what was intended to be an epic around-the-world tour of readings. Keeler spent many months crossing the globe, dipping his toe into exotic cultures, with stops in Oahu, Japan, Shanghai, Hong Kong, the Philippines, Singapore, India, Egypt, Italy, and Morocco. But Keeler had repeated difficulties arranging successful bookings while abroad. Keeler was disappointed, but he plugged away. Keeler's trip abroad ended with an extended stay in London, where he tried to break into the insular English publishing business. Keeler once again met with indifference and resistance. In 1912, while still living in London, Keeler became romantically involved with Beatrice Irwin, a charming and intriguing actress and poetess who was well-versed in new religions such as the Baha'i faith and theosophy. She had unusual theories regarding the effects of light and color and lectured on them. Their relationship almost culminated in marriage. In fact, in letters to Meredine, Keeler shared his tentative plan to return to the United States with Irwin as his wife and Meredine's new stepmother, although she'd really be more like an older sister. Shortly after, for reasons that are unclear, there was a mutual parting. During the early days of World War II, Keeler moved to Manhattan. He enrolled his children in boarding schools outside the city and attempted to gain a foothold with New York's publishers and raise his visibility through paid poetry readings. Although he was successful in getting a collection of poetry titled Victory published during that stint, the couple of years that Keeler spent in New York City failed to notably advance his career. In 1917, Keeler returned to the Bay Area for good. He moved his family into a quirky studio retreat that Keeler himself had designed and helped build in the Claremont Hills, now overlooking Highway 24. He used dynamite to blast, then build by hand, a small outdoor amphitheater in the home's front yard garden. He called his creation the Live Oak Theater. Keeler gave poetry readings and presented plays in his mini Greek theater. In 1920, in dire financial straits, Keeler decided to place his writing career on hold to earn a steadier income. He took a job as managing director of the Berkeley Chamber of Commerce and became a full-time paid city booster. Keeler served capably in that role for 7 years until a faction of business interests managed to oust him, rejecting Keeler's constant emphasis on raising Berkeley's artistic and creative profile instead of expanding its industrial base. Keeler eventually remarried. In 1921, Ormeda Curtis Harrison became Keeler's second wife. Ormeda had previously been an assistant principal at the A to Z school in Berkeley, where Keeler had also briefly taught, and she was a poet herself. From the start of their relation, it was clear that Ormeda idolized her Aladdin. She served as typist, manager, and nurse, as well as devoted wife to Keeler for the rest of his life. Keeler had a keen interest in religion. In the aughts, Keeler was a congregant at the First Unitarian Church of Berkeley and taught Sunday school there. The beautiful building that housed that church still exists alongside Bancroft Avenue near Zellerbach Hall. First Unitarian is another notable structure built in the shingle-style First Bay tradition. It was designed in 1898 by A.C. Schweinfurth and serves as a university dance studio today. As a Unitarian Church member in 1905, Keeler oversaw the production of a remarkable winter pageant he'd written. The Triumph of Light was an allegorical playlet, similar in structure to a standard nativity play, but Keeler jettisoned all of the trappings of the traditional story of Bethlehem. Instead, the congregants and the children in Keeler's Sunday school class played characters representing local birds, flowers, and symbols of the state of California. At the climax of this rather pagan play, an incarnation of love rather than Jesus is born. Keeler's pageant played to a packed hall and was, by all accounts, quite a hit. Consistent with the tolerant and equitable nature of the Unitarian faith, Keeler's Bible classes taught the church youth the basic features of the major religions of the world using a comparative religion approach. Keeler believed that familiarity with a variety of views would help his students make informed religious decisions down the line. Decades later, Keeler took his even-keeled perspective on religion a step further. In 1925, he published and distributed to open-minded acquaintances and neighbors, and then beyond, a 32-page religious tract. He titled it, An Epitome of Cosmic Religion. In this little booklet, Keeler outlined the tenets of a very unconventional belief system, one that Keeler hoped would unite instead of divide followers around the world. Keeler's cosmic religion discarded what Keeler called the personal or needlessly sectarian aspects of faith. His manifesto described a religion designed to serve those especially drawn to it. Cosmic religion would center on the worship of an ideal that Keeler believed people of all races, creeds, and classes could agree upon. Its practice involved meditating upon and personally manifesting as much as possible a conceptual trinity that together made up goodness itself. That trinity consisted of love, truth, and beauty. Cosmic religion held that the purest essence of love was expressed through service. Love's most important feature was reflected in the sentiment of helpfulness without expectation of reciprocation. Cosmic religion regarded truth as those principles of science and other subjects that were generally accepted by experts in their fields. Lastly, as to beauty, Keeler maintained that everyone around the world agreed on what was beautiful in art. This contention is arguable. But to the extent that there was any intramural tussle over aesthetics, Keeler suggested that a person of taste, well-educated in art history, could act as a gatekeeper. In all this discussion in the epitome, Keeler doesn't hide his confidence that he himself would be an ideal referee on scientific and artistic matters. Indeed, cosmic religion is a faith calculated to play to Keeler's own strengths. The epitome also sketches out Keeler's dream of establishing a monumental international headquarters for the religion, which he envisioned building in the Berkeley Hills. This cosmic headquarters would feature colorful lighting and water effects. It would contain statues in alcoves, each one honoring a different world religion. Keeler believed that operating a visually striking, inspiring destination spot would help the sect win converts and prosper. The epitome closes by discussing the essential qualities that a general manager for the cosmic religion ought to have. Its highly specific recommendations remarkably mirror Keeler's own resume. Keeler considered the creation of cosmic religion to be the crowning achievement of his career. And, in fact, the seeds of many ideas that flowered in the epitome can be traced back to themes appearing in Keeler's earliest poetry and to scientific concepts, such as evolution, that were his lifelong obsession. A handful of sympathetic, spiritually minded readers across the country received cosmic religion enthusiastically. but cosmic religion never reached a truly critical mass in Keeler's hometown. The first Berkeley Cosmic Society held its first meeting in September of 1925. However, its membership topped out at about 70 individuals, and most of them weren't willing to supply the financial support necessary to help achieve Keeler's grand vision. Cosmic religion's core principle was to live one's life healthfully, beautifully, and artistically. Cosmic Society members were supposed to aspire to perfection, even if they never achieved it, through mindfulness, service, and the creation and sophisticated appreciation of beautiful music, art, and poetry. What cosmic religion lacked, and these aren't small omissions, was a recognizable deity, an authoritative religious text, and a generation-spanning tradition. The first Berkeley Cosmic Society held its services at Keeler's Live Oak Theater in Claremont and elsewhere on Sunday evenings throughout the 1920s. Its services consisted of a series of Keeler lectures on famous historic and artistic figures and Keeler's recitation of his own poetry, interspersed with rituals and self-affirming prayers that Keeler also drafted. Often, cosmic religion services would be accompanied by public exhibitions of art and crafts made by the group's members, or the performance of classical and member-written music. To me, cosmic religion's focus on living life artistically and its elevation of aesthetics to a principle worthy of literal worship represent an especially intense performance of the arts and crafts ethos rather than anything we might recognize as a religion today. As the Great Depression deepened, the small Berkeley Society of Cosmic Religion practitioners dissolved. Keeler's final years were not happy or lucrative ones. To try to support himself in Ormeda, Keeler sought bookings to recite poetry at local public schools and shopped around some new radio plays. He developed a memoir of his recollections of the great men with whom he associated in his younger days, men like Muir, Burroughs, Keith, and Maybeck, as well as the marquee name poets from an earlier generation like Ina Coolbrith and Edwin Markham. But Keeler was unable to sell the idea. Hardly anyone cared about these people anymore. And Keeler's Victorian style of verse was out of vogue. Keeler was one of a half-dozen poets proposed to serve as California State Poet Laureate, but politics steered the honor to a Southern California rival. Keeler helped found the California Writers Club and was elected its first president. Keeler hired a writing coach to help him punch up his content and make it more attractive to modern magazines. But Keeler ended up writing his coach a pile of letters not sent, arguing with the critic that he'd chosen. The country's concerns and its prevailing style had moved on. Keeler bristled at jazz, the Charleston, decadent art, and the New Deal. As Keeler put it in a letter to his son Leonard, "I have lost influence and leadership in the last few years, and not many people who count in the world are any more interested in me." Keeler and Ormeda eked out a frugal existence in their Claremont studio, living largely on a $50 monthly remittance from Leonard. In the mid-1930s, Keeler suffered a series of blows to his health. He had a heart attack, an operation to remove most of his thyroid gland, and, as a coup de grace, broke his hip at the end of a visit to his daughter Maridine. After kissing his twin grandchildren goodbye and turning to leave, a small dog tripped Keeler. He fell down a set of steps and onto a cement sidewalk, breaking his hip. Keeler's surgeon brother-in-law, Sterling Bennell, performed an operation on Keeler, driving a metal rod into his broken pelvis to reconnect the bones. Keeler was laid up for a considerable time, missing a fiesta that had been planned to celebrate the grand opening of the Golden Gate Bridge. Keeler succumbed to a fatal heart attack at his Claremont studio in July of 1937. He was 66 years old. His funeral was held at Berkeley's First Unitarian Church, but his service was based on cosmic religion rites that Keeler himself had written a decade before. His many mourners sent heartfelt messages of condolence to his widow, with some attendees commenting on how fitting and moving the service was, and others praising Keeler's persistence, unfailing goodness of heart, and devoted loyalty to his friends. Keeler was cremated. The location of his ashes is unknown. Charles Augustus Keeler was an unusual man with panoramic interests. He was a moody and driven member and booster of Berkeley's relatively more sedate bohemian scene. His life was a model of service, open-mindedness, and creativity. His career embraced a few great triumphs, long periods of struggle, and many failures. Keeler spent a good part of his life working for this club's success. His photo, as well as his guidelines for Hillside building, are mounted on this clubhouse's walls for us to enjoy whenever we visit here. Perhaps you'll agree with me that along with his books, photos, poetry, and even his furniture, Keeler's spirit seems to surround us here tonight. Charles Keeler himself would without a doubt be delighted to know that even today, 120 years after his tenure as president of the Hillside Club, his legacy is remembered and celebrated by the people he knew and loved best, his Berkeley neighbors. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions?
Can you tell us about what the books are?
The vast majority of what he printed, published during his life, these basically go in chronological order. That book in back is the first book that he wrote, which is a study of birds. A lot of his poetry, The Simple Home is in the center there, and more poetry. His Epitome of Cosmic Religion pamphlet is there, and at the far end is a book actually written by Eloise Keeler, the youngest child of Charles Keeler, and it's a biography of Leonard, who, as I mentioned, helped develop the lie detector, and it talks about the many interesting cases that he worked on. So please take a look at them. There's a variety of most of his writings. They're mostly mine, but some are Tim Hansen's as well. So, but between the two of us, we put this display together. The question was, where is Keeler's second studio, the one that's in Claremont? And the answer is, it's a little bit difficult to find, and it is on a private road, but it is off El Camino Real. If you go up Uplands and then on El Camino Real, it's actually down a driveway and a private little path. So if one is... The amphitheater now, the question is the amphitheater still there? You can see the slope of where the amphitheater is, but it is overgrown with plants. But interestingly enough, there's a little tiny stage area. I don't think it's used for anything, but there's a little stage area that seems to be, I don't think it's original, but I think it's a remnant of the idea of the kind of presentations he used to give there. And he used to give poetry readings to servicemen on leave, and a lot of the, as I said, a lot of the cosmic religion services were held there. When he built it, his children were very opposed to it. They thought it was very, very strange, and they did not want they said, no family has a garden theater like that, and people will think we're quite queer if we have something like that. So they didn't like it. He received criticism of his theory when he wrote his book in 1893. He didn't like that very much, and he quickly thereafter became turned off of science completely. He felt that he had taken a wrong path, without being quite specific about the Lamarckian being wrong, but he felt that he had better things that he could do with his intelligence. The question was whether Maybeck had anything to do with the idea of the temple that he wanted to build for cosmic religion in the hills. And the answer is no, because it never got that far. But in the teens, Keeler and Maybeck were kicking around the idea of setting up an arts and crafts community basically a little Roycroft, essentially, in the Berkeley Hills. And there'd be different areas, and he did work with Maybeck on the idea for that, but that never materialized either. Later on, he thought a little bit smaller and found a lot on Telegraph that he thought could be a temple for cosmic religion. But very quickly, the religion starts turning to, well, we'll have the temple and back, but we're also going to need a space for printing. We're going to need a space for copper work. We're going to need a space for decorating and painting. It's really an arts and crafts aesthetic more than a religion. It's raising arts and crafts to worship, which is easy to do if you're into arts and crafts. But it's interesting to see it taken so literally. The question is whether Keeler had done anything to support the arts during his tenure as at the Berkeley Chamber of Commerce, and the answer is yes. That was really some of his primary focus. And he was very, very concerned about supporting artists and poets and writers who, in their old age, had no independent means of support. I think he was looking at his own future. A lot of what you see during the end of his career is him trying to find some space for himself, some administrative position, preferably in the arts, where he could do what he liked and also administer, because he was a wonderful organizer. So yes, one of the things that he wanted to do was create stipends for writers and artists. He was thinking specifically of both Ina Coolbrith, who was in very hard times, and Edwin Markham. He said, this man is 80 years old and he has to go on tour reading his poems. You could see him thinking to himself, I don't want to be doing that when I'm 80 to earn my money. The question is whether Albert Einstein, who had an idea of something similar to the cosmic religion, had an influence on Keeler or vice versa. And the answer is no, they were independently thought of. And Keeler's focus on the arts was really something that wasn't necessarily Einstein's. But there are similarities there between Keeler's idea of a cosmic religion and Einstein's similar version of a less divisive kind of religion that could unite the people. The question is whether what Keeler's relationship with the university was over the years. And it had better periods and worse periods. Keeler loved the Greek theater. Towards the end of his life, he gave a poetry recital in the Greek theater. But in the teens and 20s, he started resisting about the Bolshevik professors at the University of California. He was rather conservative, and he didn't want the students getting any of these radical labor ideas while attending. And he also thought that the university's leadership put too much work on one particular man. So the best thing would be to change the position into two separate positions, and the person currently in position could take one, and guess who would be good to take the other position? So that was his role. It was a cooperative relationship, but it did change over the years. I don't think that there's anything in the Southern California book, and it might have been a little bit before Green and Green. It was 1899 when they took their train trip, and the train trip, although they did stop in Pasadena, and they talk about Pasadena being very beautiful, there's not a real focus on the architecture. It's more the missions, the kind of tourist places, the inns that one could stay in, and that sort of thing. There isn't as much of a focus on architecture in that. It really is a couple years later, after living in Keeler House, I think is when the light bulb really went on from the experience of having lived in there for several years that led to his involvement with the Hillside Club and the creation of the Simple Home. Just a couple years later. Question is about Keeler's relationship with Luther Burbank in Santa Rosa, and they were close. Burbank was one of the figures that Keeler had profiled for his Friends Bearing Torches, which was his unpublished book, not published during his lifetime, but in a wonderful small printing by the Klinker Press, which is also on the table here featured, printed by Andre Chavez, who is with us tonight in the back of the hall. He was one of the people, the dozen figures that he profiled. They were close. Burbank and he corresponded, and Burbank's door, although it was closed to many people who wanted to go up to Santa Rosa and visit his home and gardens there, it was open to Keeler, and also other members of the Harriman expedition also liked to visit him. And I recommend actually visiting the Santa Rosa home and gardens of Luther Burbank, since independently it's a great place to visit, very interesting. A very old greenhouse there, that's worth seeing. The question is, what is the purpose for all those odd poses in bed sheets? What is that all about? And that is the beauty of Berkeley's bohemian culture, which wasn't like the San Francisco guys drinking till 3 o'clock in the morning and writing bad poetry to make fun of people. It was a Grecian ideal. The ideal was the Athens of the West. That's where all the togas come from. And those poses were actually studies that were used. I can, later on, if people are interested, I can show one of the poses was actually turned into headpieces and tailpieces, illustrations for some of his poetry. So they were dressing up so that those photos could be taken and turned into drawings to create an artistic illustrations for his poetry. But truth be told, people like getting dressed up in bed sheets and running around barefoot in Berkeley in those days. If I were there, I'd probably want to do that too. It was a forerunner of the hippies. It didn't have a lot of things in common with the hippies. It didn't go as far as they did, but that back to nature, barefoot, free breathing kind of thing was definitely a part of the heritage going back to the early settlement of Berkeley. The question is, how old were Keeler's children when Louise died in 1907. And Meridine, I believe, was around 7. Leonard was probably around 3, and Eloise was around 1 or 2. They were very, very young. They're babes in arms in the photos from that period. And one of the problematic aspects of Keeler in assessing his life is that he, as I mentioned, he left his children with his mother-in-law and spent years and years abroad. He was an absentee father for many years, and it bore scars in the children. He tried to make up for his absence by writing 50-page letters telling his children how to eat, how to sleep, how to breathe. I mean, it was really daunting. It was overwhelming. But a small child needs the actual presence of someone, and you can't make up for it by doubling the written recommendations that you give to them. So that was tough, and you can see the ramifications in all of the children as they grew up. They had a fraught relationship with him. The chair was brought here today by Carol McPherson, who is a wonderful arts and crafts enthusiast and very generously brought it. It is a chair that bears a mark underneath it of Bernard Maybeck, his monogram of Annie and Maybeck. And if you look at the front of it, there's also pyrography detail, just like the screen has pyrographic detail written with a pen that creates heat, that you can draw designs, done by Louise, she tells me. And that chair is related to the chairs that you can find in the Swedenborgian Church, which is the archetypical arts and crafts chair. And that's a whole discussion in itself about the chairs, but it's related to those chairs, and it's some of the earliest exemplars of arts and crafts furniture as currently regarded.
I want you all to give a hand.
Thank you. My pleasure, really. I do want to mention that tonight with us, we are very, very fortunate to have some descendants of Charles Keeler, one of whom came all the way across the country. Brittany Davis came from Virginia, the great-great-granddaughter of Charles Keeler, and Ann Miller as well, descendants of Charles Keeler, and I think they deserve a hand for coming out here and for their illustrious forebears. So you might want to chat them up too.
All right, so just, say who you are and where you came from and how you fit into all this.
Sure. My name is Brittany Davis, and I am Charles Keeler's great-great-granddaughter. And I flew here yesterday from Roanoke, Virginia, just for this event. And I contacted my second cousin, who is also related to Charles Keeler, and got her to come too. And I've always felt a connection, and I felt it was a birthright to be part of this.
Yeah,
I'm here.
great. Well, thank you for coming.